Welcome to this explainer. Imagine a mathematically impossible military stand that somehow birthed history's most baffling wartime mystery. We are dropping right into the mud, the blinding smoke, and the sheer absolute panic of August 1914. Picture a quiet little Belgian town suddenly turning into the stage for an unprecedented slaughter. Men are pushed so far beyond the breaking point, and out of that absolute nightmare, a story emerges that totally defies logic. Actual, glowing, spectral figures descending from the sky to shield the dying.
So how did a completely fictional newspaper story convince an entire army they were seeing ghosts? Well, to figure that out, we have to jump to the morning of August 23, 1914, the Battle of Mons. This is literally the last breath of quiet before the entire world fractures. The British Expeditionary Force, highly trained but honestly pretty small, has just rolled in. They'd been marching through French villages to cheering crowds, people throwing flowers at their boots. It honestly felt like a parade. But that illusion shatters the second the sun comes up over the canal. Because across the water, a massive tidal wave of field gray uniforms is coming right at them. The German First Army had arrived.
The math that morning pointed to exactly one outcome: absolute annihilation. You've got roughly 70,000 British soldiers staring down a staggering 150,000 Germans. The British commander orders his completely outnumbered men to dig shallow trenches. They are facing this massive, highly coordinated machine designed to just crush them instantly. By any realistic calculation, the British line should have collapsed within the hour. Outmanned, outgunned, it was supposed to be a total massacre.
But here's the wild part. The British didn't break. And the reason why is this incredible, almost superhuman quirk in their training. These soldiers were firing their standard-issue bolt-action rifles with such a frantic mechanical rhythm, an astonishing 15 aimed shots per minute. That's insane. It was so fast it completely stalled the German advance. The fire was so intense that German commanders frantically radioed back that they had stumbled into heavily armed machine gun battalions. But they hadn't. There were no extra machine guns. It was just desperate men working the bolts of their rifles so fast their hands literally blistered, creating an absolute wall of lead.
But as that brutal fighting eventually gave way to a chaotic, blistering retreat across France, some absolutely wild whispers began to spread through the exhausted ranks. Soldiers, nurses, officers, they all started reporting something impossible. They claimed to have seen luminous, spectral figures, angelic presences glowing with this unearthly light, stepping right out onto the battlefield. According to these breathtaking accounts, these glowing guardians physically positioned themselves between the retreating British and the pursuing German cavalry. The legend of the Angels of Mons was officially born, and it spread through the ranks like wildfire.
Okay, are you ready for the massive plot twist? The Angels? They started entirely as fiction. Seriously. Enter Arthur Machen, a struggling London journalist who wrote a purely fictional fantasy story called The Bowman, literally just to pay his rent. But the desperate, grieving British public completely absorbed his story as historical fact. Within weeks, Machen was getting letters from clergy and officers' wives insisting his story was real. When a panicked Machen published disclaimers screaming from the rooftops, "Hey, I made it up," the public flat out ignored him. They decided he was just trying to cover up a genuine miracle.
I mean, think about it. If an entire army saw glowing angels on August 23rd, you'd expect their letters home to mention it immediately, right? But the dates completely expose the truth here. The battle happens in August, Machen publishes his totally made-up story in late September, and it isn't until months later in early 1915 that the so-called eyewitness accounts miraculously start popping up in the press. When investigators finally dug into this, they found a pretty devastating reality. Not a single verifiable first-hand account of the angels existed before Arthur Machen's fiction hit the newsstands. The story generated the legend, absolutely not the other way around.
What's super fascinating here is how the public completely warped the original story. Machen didn't even write about angels. His story was about gritty, medieval English longbowmen from the Battle of Agincourt rising from the dead, like ghost archers. But as the tale spread, those grim, undead soldiers were rapidly replaced by glowing Christian angels of peace. Why? Well, because angels were a much more comforting symbol for a terrified nation than, undead medieval soldiers. The legend mutated perfectly to fit the emotional needs of the people. It evolved from a creepy ghost story into a message of divine reassurance.
So you might be wondering, how do hundreds of grounded professional soldiers end up believing a fake newspaper story is their actual memory? Well, you push the human body until it breaks. Imagine staying awake for 3 days straight under constant enemy fire.
During the retreat, these guys marched up to 30 miles a day in blistering heat. They were starving, traumatized, and dangerously sleep-deprived. Science tells us that staying awake for 48 to 72 hours under that kind of extreme stress is the perfect recipe for intense visual hallucinations. Their exhausted brains were just misfiring, so when they eventually heard the myth of the angels, their minds eagerly seized on that imagery to explain the terrifying visual distortions they had actually experienced on the battlefield.
But this legend didn't just survive because of exhausted soldiers. It survived because the folks back home desperately needed it. Press coverage at the time was heavily censored. People knew things were going horribly wrong out there, but they were kept completely in the dark. And into that terrifying silence stepped the church and the state, who realized, hey, this myth is incredibly useful for morale. But mostly, it offered the ultimate psychological life raft to grieving mothers and widows. They deeply needed to believe their boys weren't just dying alone in the mud of a foreign country, but were actually being escorted into the next life by divine guardians.
So we know the angels were born from the pen of a struggling writer. We know the battlefield sightings were fueled by extreme trauma and severe sleep deprivation. But for a shattered society enduring the unprecedented slaughter of the First World War, this legend functioned as a miraculous coping mechanism. It kept families from completely breaking apart and gave soldiers the courage to actually return to the trenches. So I'll leave you with this to close out our explainer. If the human mind's ultimate placebo effect is belief, does it actually matter that the angels of Mons were pure fiction when the profound comfort they brought to a traumatized nation was completely, undeniably real?